You've probably heard this story in the newspapers. The USS Gerald R. Ford, a $13 billion technological marvel, the spearhead of the decade's most intense naval blockade, suddenly caught fire, and shortly afterward, it withdrew from the combat zone. All the headlines that day were identical. Fire cripples America's super aircraft carrier. But that wasn't the whole truth. The fire started in an unexpected area, the laundry room. It was quickly contained by the crew. There was no catastrophic structural damage, no weapon systems or nuclear reactors were threatened. Even the official assessment report from the U.S. Navy later clearly stated the ship remained fully mission capable. So, let's put this piece of the puzzle on the table and look closely. If that fire wasn't big enough to cripple the Ford, why was it still powerful enough to pull the ship off one of the vital links in the entire operation? Why did an incident that any old Nimitz-class carrier could easily handle suddenly become the straw that broke the camel's back for the most modern warship in human history? This video isn't about a laundry room fire. This video is about a strategic equation cracking from within, and when that equation breaks, what's exposed isn't just the Ford's weakness. It's a devastating question aimed directly at the future of the entire U.S. carrier force. Can technological power overcome the limits of resilience? Welcome to Naval Trace. The game has only just begun. To understand the downfall of the Ford, we must look away from the fire and into the trap it was caught in. Operation Epic Fury was not simply a retaliatory bombing campaign. The Pentagon's focus wasn't on sinking how many Iranian warships or leveling how much missile infrastructure. The real goal was far more ambitious and ruthless: geographical control. The U.S. Navy was attempting to shut down a nation's sea lanes by strangling three of the world's most vital maritime choke points. The first, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow bottleneck determines the fate of over 20% of global oil. The second, Bab el-Mandeb, the southern gateway to the Red Sea, which holds the lifeline of 12% of the world's maritime trade. And the third, the western approach to the Suez Canal, the final and only way out to connect with the European market. Look at the numbers to see the gravity of this gamble. If they successfully lock all three doors, the U.S. will not only deliver a devastating military blow, they will strategically suffocate their opponent, isolate their economy, and completely strip them of their freedom of maneuver on the ocean. On the battle table, the Pentagon has drawn up a perfect concept called Coffin geometry: 3 super aircraft carriers, 3 steel walls, no backdoor, no escape. A perfect force deployment plan, showcasing the absolute dominance of ocean power. But that's also where our story begins to crack. Because what's drawn on the map and what's actually happening on the sea are two completely different realities. That perfect trap, in fact, never existed. On the Pentagon's plexiglass panel, 3 aircraft carriers were listed, but on the morning Operation Epic Fury officially launched, aside from the waves on the battlefield, only 2 were actually operational. The USS Abraham Lincoln was firmly positioned in the Strait of Hormuz. The USS Gerald R. Ford was now in its 9th month of continuous deployment. And the third, the final piece of the strategic geometry, the USS George H.W. Bush, it remained quietly anchored at Norfolk Naval Base, thousands of nautical miles from the combat zone, still awaiting combat readiness certification. It hadn't yet entered its position. And this was the fatal flaw that the seemingly perfect map had deliberately concealed. The Ford wasn't just a vertex in the strategic triangle, it was being stretched to its limit. That 100,000-ton steel mass had to slide continuously from the Mediterranean across the Caribbean, then hastily through the Suez Canal into the Red Sea, just to fill a gap that no one had yet filled. To put it most accurately, what looked like an unbreakable model from day one was the image of 2 aircraft carriers desperately straining to cover 3 doors. This is the first point of exposure in the scenario. The collapse of the USS Gerald R. Ford did not appear unexpectedly on the day the fire broke out. That breaking point was initiated the day the Pentagon decided to operate a massive operation with a missing link, yet expected their machine to continue running as if nothing had happened. But the ocean never lies, and a cruel countdown clock had been silently activated long before. The 24th of June, 2025, the USS Gerald R. Ford set sail from Norfolk. Theoretically, everything began like a textbook. It embarked on a standard 6-month deployment. U.S. Navy doctrine dictates a very strict cycle. Deploy to the ocean, engage, return, maintenance, and reset. That's the core biological rhythm of any fleet. These massive and complex war machines, however advanced, are not designed to run indefinitely. But for the Ford, that return milestone never arrived. The initial phase days in the Mediterranean, everything went according to plan. But in October 2025, it was abruptly diverted to the Caribbean. A new battlefield brought with it a completely unfamiliar mission profile. And then, the 28th of February 2026 arrived. Operation Epic Fury erupted. The Ford was still not called home. It received orders to turn east, plunging through the Suez Canal into the fiery Red Sea. Let's pause for a moment to understand the gravity of this. This isn't simply a story of a longer than usual deployment. It's three distinct geographical battlefields, three completely out of sync combat rhythms, the intensity of sorties constantly shifting, and the number of scheduled maintenance days in between, none. The devastation isn't about adding up the days on the calendar. The devastation is about the cumulative wear and tear. The system has no time to breathe. From the moment the ship passed its 108, don't get me wrong, by every parameter, the Ford is more powerful, faster, and superior to any Nimitz-class aircraft carrier ever built. The heart of that power is EMALS, Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System. It allows the Ford to maintain an incredible sortie rate, 270 flights per day. It launches fighters more smoothly, more accurately, and minimizes airframe stress. But that greatness comes at an invisible cost. The Ford's power is tied to an interdependent digital network of subsystems. Every module, every data link is interdependent to function. Let's use an analogy to understand what really happened. A Nimitz-class carrier uses a steam catapult. When it fails mechanically. A valve leaks, a pipe cracks. It's noisy, easily recognizable, and can be diagnosed visually. A chief mechanic can take a wrench down to the ship's hull, tap on the exact faulty spot, and fix the problem. It operates just like a classic mechanical clock. A broken gear, you hear a clicking sound immediately, and you know exactly what needs replacing. But the Ford doesn't run on gears. It's an electronic clock. Each circuit board, each independent power module inside that electronic clock is 1,000 times more reliable than a mechanical gear. However, if you push it to its limits, forcing that dependent chain to run for hundreds of days straight without giving it time to reset properly, the fault won't appear little by little. Starting from a small overload, the fault will spread in a domino effect. And then, the entire system shuts down. The screen goes black. There were no warning sounds, no broken gears for you to grab a wrench and fix. Here's the most important thing to take away after this analysis. This video absolutely does not conclude that the Ford is a terrible ship. No superpower throws $13 billion out the window to acquire a piece of junk. What the laundry room incident exposed is a chilling truth for the US Navy. Their modernization process was based on an unproven assumption. They assumed that by replacing mechanical simplicity with digital complexity, they would naturally achieve durability. That assumption looked perfect on paper, until it was dragged into the field and subjected to sustained combat tempo across three different battlefields. War doesn't read technical blueprints. War only seeks fault lines. The 12th of March, 2026, a fire broke out in the laundry area at the stern of the ship. It wasn't a cruise missile attack. The ship's firefighters quickly brought the blaze under control. There was no catastrophic damage to the core structure. However, toxic smoke seeping through the ventilation system forced hundreds of sailors to evacuate from adjacent rest areas. This is where we must uncover a layer of truth often overlooked in military news reports. When talking about supercarriers, people are often fascinated by the hardware, radar systems, nuclear reactors, or electronic warfare modules. But the Ford is not just a block of steel carrying weapons. It is a floating city carrying 5,000 lives. That's 5,000 people and a massive ecosystem, including life support systems, sleeping quarters, kitchens, and living support, all operating at relentless combat tempo for months on end. And here's the second twist in the whole affair. The technology didn't break first. The EMALS electromagnetic catapults were still functioning. The AN/SPY-4 radar was still scanning targets perfectly. The first thing to collapse was the organism surrounding the technology. The core problem wasn't a short circuit in an electronic circuit board. The problem lay in the mechanical and biological limits of the entire ecosystem living, sleeping, operating, and bearing the load inside that steel structure. After 283 consecutive days of strain across three battlefields without a single day of maintenance, the fire in the laundry room wasn't the cause. It was merely the final symptom of accumulated fatigue. So if someone says the fire ended the Ford's deployment, that's a misconception. The harsh truth is far more brutal. The relentless prolongation of the deployment ultimately ended. To fill that fatal gap, the Pentagon didn't send another futuristic supercarrier. They sent the final chapter of a legacy. USS George H.W. Bush, the last Nimitz-class aircraft carrier ever built. This is the ultimate ultimate symbolic contrast. The Ford represents the future, the maximum capability ceiling, and the complexity of the digital age. Meanwhile, the Bush represents the past, the reliability floor, and the stoicism of mechanical endurance. The Bush lacked the EMALS electromagnetic catapult system. It still used steam catapults, a technology whose core dates back to 1955. It was noisy, heavy, and could never reach the Ford's record of 270 sorties per day. But the Bush possessed a weapon that Ford's state-of-the-art systems desperately craved. For 9 months, while Ford was exhausted across 3 battlefields, the Bush sat at Norfolk Base. It received routine maintenance. Its systems were upgraded. It passed its certification cycles. And most importantly, the 5,000 men on board were given a rest. Make no mistake, military freshness is not a luxury. It is a strategic asset. The Bush didn't set sail to salvage Operation Geometry because it was more modern or had better specifications. It set sail because it was ready. When a battle equation is missing, the ocean doesn't ask your ship for electronics or steam valves. The ocean asks only one question: are you here? And that was the moment when a seemingly dry concept in naval doctrine suddenly became a vital truth. Availability is capability in itself. The modern Ford has brought down the ceiling, and now it's time for Nimitz's great legacy to step up to support the floor. The Bush has arrived. The Lincoln remains standing. Through the lens of the media, it appears the U.S. Navy has filled the gap and restored the balance of power. But look closely at the map. The Bush arrived to occupy a position it should have occupied from the beginning: the Mediterranean. The devastating consequence is that Bab el-Mandeb, the choke point controlling 12% of global trade, now lacks any direct carrier protection. In military strategy, physics doesn't care about emotional arguments or political pronouncements. A carrier strike group can only project its maximum effective deterrent power within a radius of about 500 nautical miles. The distance from the eastern Mediterranean to Bab el-Mandeb is 1,800 nautical miles. This means it exceeds the actual deterrent limit by 3.5 times. You can't bend physics. There is no magic formula for a single ship to simultaneously hold one vertex of a triangle and exert significant presence pressure on another vertex thousands of miles away. And America's enemies understand this mathematical equation very well. In the same week that the Ford was forced to withdraw from its launch pad in the Red Sea, Houthi forces from Yemen launched a series of ballistic missile and armed drone attacks against Israel. These were their first real military actions in the conflict. While the Ford was still prominently present, they calculated and chose restraint. When the Ford disappeared from the equation, they immediately acted to test the silence. This is the most fundamental and brutal rule of sea power. Presence is deterrence. Absence is an invitation. What was removed from Bab el-Mandeb that day wasn't just a block of steel named Gerald R. Ford. What was removed was a massive living deterrent. And the 3-door trap of Operation Epic Fury was, once again, exposed. At this point, we are forced to confront a truth. The events in the Red Sea are no longer a deployment problem. It has become a brutal test of the entire U.S. Navy's doctrine of warfare. On the whiteboards at the Pentagon, both the Nimitz and Ford classes of carriers present seemingly perfect logic. The Nimitz-class carriers were born to answer the survival question: how to maintain a high-intensity naval air presence for as long as possible. Meanwhile, the Ford-class carriers carry a grander, more ambitious mission: how to push the power, deployment capabilities, and role of aircraft carriers in the kill chain to a level unmatched by any adversary on the planet. Neither logic is law. The minds that designed them weren't stupid. The only problem is, real war never follows the lines drawn on a whiteboard. War has a cruel power. It erases all blueprints. The hardest lesson to swallow from this laundry room incident isn't the condemnation of the unreliable Ford. The real lesson is far more profound and alarming. It proves that the entire modernization effort of the U.S. Navy was built on a massive, unproven assumption. They assume that when you equip a ship with the sophistication of digital technology to maximize its capabilities, its endurance will automatically be guaranteed. They threw a cutting-edge system, never tested in real combat, into a sustained multi-theater combat environment. They forced it to maintain a relentless fighting pace and hoped it would function perfectly, like the computer simulations. But the Pentagon built a warship with the greatest destructive power in human history, forgetting that, in a prolonged war, the most powerful system is not necessarily the one that survives the longest. Right now, the supercarrier USS Gerald R. Ford is anchored in Split, Croatia. The USS George H.W. Bush is struggling across the Atlantic to defend a wall it wasn't originally planned to defend at this time. The Lincoln is patiently holding its ground at Hormuz. And Bab el-Mandeb? that gateway to death remains wide open. The siege of Iran continues, but its strategic geometry is no longer a closed coffin. It is transformed into a funnel, and through that enormous gap, the Houthi forces are quietly testing the limits of silence. $13 billion. That enormous sum has bought the highest sortie rate ever recorded in naval history. It has bought the absolute precision of digital launch technology and a power architecture ready for laser weapons that haven't even been invented yet. None of those investment decisions were a mistake, but the real battle unfolding out there is asking a completely different question. The battlefield isn't asking, how fast can you launch an aircraft? It's coldly asking, how long can you stay at sea? And the ship grappling with that question is the last one built on the technological foundation of the past. It's been running on steam since 1955, shouldering a strategic equation that the ship of the future helped build but couldn't sustain on its own. The ford will certainly be repaired. The strategic gap will eventually be closed. But there's one question the Pentagon's next shipbuilding budget must answer as honestly as possible. When you design a warship to achieve maximum combat capability, what percentage of endurance are you sacrificing? In a world where U.S. strategy demands that aircraft carriers constantly strain themselves across multiple battlefields, constantly changing mission profiles, and operating on unpredictable timelines, is the superior ship the one that accomplishes more or the one that lives longer? If today's variable changes the way you think about the giant war machines protecting the world, please subscribe. We'll see you again in the next decoding session.